The room smelled like smoke and defeat. It was the spring of 1945, and the war in Europe was bleeding out its final days. Allied forces had pushed deep into German territory, liberating towns, uncovering horrors, and collecting the wreckage of a collapsing empire. For General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, these weeks were supposed to be a moment of vindication. Years of fury, frustration, and brilliance finally crystallizing into victory. His army had moved faster, fought harder, and covered more ground than any force in the history of modern warfare. He had earned this moment, but somewhere inside a building that still carried the stench of Nazi authority, something happened that no one in the room had expected. SS officers, men who had built their careers on intimidation, on fear, on the absolute certainty that rank and ruthlessness could open any door, sat across from Patton and made a demand. Not a request, a demand. The room went still. Those who were there later described what followed as one of the most electric moments they had ever witnessed. Patton's face changed. His jaw locked. His eyes, already known for their cold and predatory focus, shifted into something that even seasoned combat veterans found difficult to look at directly. And then he exploded. What those SS officers asked for that day has been debated, buried, and quietly passed down through the accounts of men who were in that room. What Patton said in response was never meant for public record, and what happened in the hours that followed would ripple far beyond that single confrontation, touching the highest levels of Allied command, challenging the very terms of what victory was supposed to mean, and forcing a question that history has never fully answered. What exactly did those SS officers demand, and why did it make one of the most decorated generals in American history lose control? To understand what happened in that room, you have to understand what Patton was by 1945. Not the legend, not the movie, the actual man, the contradictions inside him, the rage he carried, the idealism buried beneath the theater and the swagger and the ivory-handled revolvers. Because what those SS officers asked for didn't just offend Patton the soldier, it reached something deeper, something personal. George Smith Patton Jr. had been preparing for war his entire life. He came from a military family that traced its service back to the American Revolution and the Civil War. His ancestors had bled for the country. He grew up believing that history was made by warriors, that civilization rested on the shoulders of men willing to fight and die for what they believed was right. He read Caesar and Napoleon not as historical curiosities, but as instruction manuals. He believed with absolute conviction that he had been placed on earth for a singular purpose, to lead men in battle and to win. He also carried a temper that had already nearly destroyed his career twice. The slapping incidents in Sicily in 1943 were the most famous. Two separate moments when Patton struck shell-shocked soldiers in field hospitals, calling them cowards, refusing to accept that the mind could break the same way the body could. Eisenhower had been furious. The press had been savage. Congressional voices had called for Patton's removal. He had been sidelined, humiliated, forced to apologize publicly, while lesser generals were handed the commands he should have led. He survived it. He always survived it. Because as much as people hated his arrogance, they needed his genius. When the Normandy breakout stalled, it was Patton they turned to. When Bastogne was surrounded and the Bulge looked like a catastrophe that might unravel everything, it was Patton who turned his entire army 90 degrees in one of the most extraordinary logistical pivots in military history and drove through ice and snow to relieve the siege. He was indispensable and insufferable in equal measure. By the spring of 1945, he had pushed so deep into Germany that he was regularly outrunning his supply lines. His army took towns faster than maps could be updated. He moved with a speed that confounded German commanders who had never encountered a general who simply refused to stop. While other Allied forces paused, consolidated, and reported back to headquarters, Patton kept moving. He believed, and he was right, that momentum was its own weapon. Every hour you stopped was an hour the enemy used to dig in. But it wasn't just Germans he was fighting anymore. As the Third Army swept through Bavaria and Austria, they were entering the territory where the Nazi regime had done its most concentrated work of horror: concentration camps. extermination facilities, administrative centers of the SS Empire that had managed the systematic murder of millions of people. Patton's forces were among the first to enter Buchenwald. They liberated Ohrdruf. They moved through a landscape that looked, on the surface, like a defeated civilization, but was in reality the crime scene of the greatest atrocity in recorded history. Patton was not a sentimental man. He had seen death in volumes that would have broken most people. He had walked through fields covered with the bodies of his own soldiers. He had personally overseen the burial of men whose names he knew, whose families he would sometimes write to. Death was his professional medium. He understood it, accepted it, and moved through it with a discipline that bordered on the mechanical. But what he saw in those camps was different. It cracked something open. There are accounts from members of his staff who saw Patton physically ill after walking through Ohrdruf. He reportedly went behind a building to compose himself. He then ordered every available American soldier in the area, along with the local German civilian population, to walk through the camp. He wanted them to see it. He wanted the Germans to see it. He wanted no one who was anywhere near that place to be able to claim they didn't know, or that it wasn't real, or that the stories were exaggerated. He then had the local mayor and his wife brought to the camp. The couple, it was said, hanged themselves that night. Patton filed a report to Eisenhower that was uncharacteristically spare in its language. He did not dramatize what he had seen. He did not reach for the thunderous rhetoric he used in his speeches. He simply described what was there, and the flatness of the description was somehow more devastating than anything elaborate he might have written. He was angry, and not in the way he was usually angry, not the theatrical fury he used as a tactical instrument, not the deliberate explosion designed to motivate or intimidate. This was something quieter and more dangerous, a moral fury, the kind that doesn't dissipate after a few hours, but instead goes cold and sits in the chest and waits. It was in this state of mind that Patton encountered the SS officers. The exact circumstances have been reconstructed from multiple sources, accounts from members of his staff, post-war interviews, declassified reports, and the recollections of interpreters who were present. What follows is drawn from the historical record, assembled into a coherent sequence of events that illuminates not just what happened in that room, but why it happened, and what. It revealed about the man at the center of it. It began with a surrender negotiation that wasn't supposed to be a negotiation at all. In the final weeks of the war, as the Wehrmacht collapsed and German commanders scrambled to determine what to do with their remaining forces, a number of SS units found themselves in the path of Patton's Third Army. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were ideological warriors, men who had volunteered for Heinrich Himmler's personal army, who had participated in the machinery of terror that Patton had just seen the results of in those camps. Some of them had direct blood on their hands. Others had commanded units that did. All of them wore the insignia of an organization that the Allied powers had already agreed would be tried as a criminal enterprise. The formal surrender of German forces was still days away. In this ambiguous window, some SS commanders saw an opportunity, not to escape. Most of them understood that escape was no longer realistic, but to negotiate, to position themselves, to shape, if possible, the terms under which they entered Allied captivity. And so a delegation was arranged. SS officers, under a flag of truce, requested a meeting with American command. The request worked its way up through the chain until it reached a level where someone decided, for reasons that remain somewhat unclear, that it should be handled at the Third Army level, which meant it landed on Patton's desk. He agreed to the meeting. His staff was uncertain about the wisdom of this. Some of them worried that Patton's well-documented temper combined with a room full of SS officers was a combination that could produce nothing good. But Patton insisted. He wanted to look at them. He wanted to hear what they had to say. He had spent years fighting an enemy he could only see through the lens of battle reports and aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations. Now, they were coming to him. The meeting was held in a commandeered building. Accounts vary on the precise location, placing it somewhere in Bavaria, in a town that had been captured within the previous week. The building still had Nazi administrative materials scattered through it. maps, files. The detritus of an apparatus that had believed, until recently, that it was going to last 1,000 years. Patton arrived with a small group of staff officers and an interpreter. He did not dress down for the occasion. He wore his full uniform, his helmet, his ribbons, the ivory-handled revolvers at his hips. He was, as always, performing, but performing in service of a psychological objective. He wanted the SS officers to see American military authority at its most deliberate and uncompromising. The SS delegation entered. There were reportedly 3 or 4 of them, senior officers, men of significant rank within Himmler's organization. They were still in their uniforms, the SS insignia still on their collars. They had not yet been formally processed as prisoners of war, which meant they were operating in a legal gray zone that they clearly intended to exploit. Through the interpreter, the meeting opened with the kind of formal courtesies that soldiers on both sides had learned to observe even in the most hostile circumstances. Patton said nothing that wasn't necessary. He watched them. He let the silence do its work, and then they made their demand. The precise wording has been rendered differently in different accounts, but the substance is consistent. The SS officers stated that they were prepared to surrender their forces that were still armed and still occupying positions, on one condition. They wanted guarantees. Specifically, they wanted assurances that their men would be treated as prisoners of war under the terms of the Geneva Convention, that they would be held by American forces, rather than turned over to Soviet forces, and here was the part that detonated the room, that their senior officers would be given the same courtesies and protections as any other military commanders. They wanted to be treated not as criminals, not as members of a designated criminal organization, but as soldiers. They wanted, in effect, to be normalized, to be received as combatants who had simply fought on the losing side, rather than as what they actually were, architects and instruments of a system of murder that Patton had just personally walked through the evidence of. There was a pause after the interpreter finished rendering their words into English. Those who were in the room described what happened to Patton's face as something they had never seen before, even from a man famous for his explosive reactions. It wasn't just anger. It was a kind of comprehensive contempt, the expression of a man who has just had something so deeply offensive placed in front of him that the ordinary registers of emotional response are inadequate to contain it. He looked at them for what witnesses described as a very long moment. Then he stood up. What followed was, by every account, extraordinary. Patton did not simply raise his voice. He did not produce the theatrical tirade that had become something of a legend among his own troops, the carefully orchestrated profanity and thunder that he used before battles. To ignite his men, this was different. This was personal. This was a man who had seen Ohrdruf and Buchenwald speaking directly to men who represented the organization that had built those places. He told them, in language that the interpreter reportedly struggled to render with full accuracy because the speed and force of Patton's delivery was difficult to keep pace with, that they had no right to make demands of any kind, that they were not soldiers in any sense he recognized, that what they wore on their collars was not a military insignia, it was evidence, that he had personally walked through what their organization had left behind, and that the smell of it was still in his clothes, and that the sight of it was something he would carry for the rest of his life. He told them that the idea that they could sit across from him and present conditions, that they had the audacity, after what their organization had done, to talk to him about courtesies and protections and treatment, was the most obscene thing he had encountered in 3 years of war. He told them they would surrender unconditionally or they would not surrender at all, and that if they chose not to surrender, his army would come through their remaining positions the way it had come through everything else, fast, hard, and without any of the restraint that they seemed to think they were entitled to negotiate for. He then told them something else, something that went beyond the military calculus of surrender terms. He told them that he intended to make sure, personally, to whatever degree was within his power, that what their organization had done was fully accounted for, that the documents, the witnesses, the evidence he had seen, and that his forces were continuing to collect would be used to ensure that accountability was not avoided through procedural maneuvering or the application of legal classifications designed to normalize the abnormal. He was not speaking as a general accepting a surrender. He was speaking as a man who had seen something that had changed what he thought the war was about. The SS officers had come into that room believing that their rank, their bearing, and the leverage of their still-armed forces gave them a negotiating position. They left without it. The meeting ended in minutes. Accounts differ on exactly how the SS officers responded as they were escorted out. Some versions say they were silent. Some say one of them attempted a reply and was cut off. What's consistent is that the demand they had come in with was simply gone. Not negotiated away, not modified, but evaporated by the force of what Patton had put in the room. The surrender of those units, when it came, was unconditional. But the aftermath of that meeting was more complicated than the moment itself. Word of what had happened spread quickly. Not to the public, Patton's staff was experienced at keeping internal incidents from becoming press stories, particularly after the Sicily slapping incidents had demonstrated how badly those kinds of stories could damage both Patton and the broader war effort. But within the Allied command structure, the story circulated. Reactions were mixed, and the mixture was revealing. Some commanders heard what Patton had done and understood it completely. Men who had also seen the camps, who had also walked through the evidence of what the SS had organized and carried out, felt that the demand those officers had made deserved exactly the response it had received. The idea of extending professional military courtesies to men who had overseen or participated in mass murder was, to many of them, a fundamental moral absurdity. Others were more cautious. The Allied military was a political as well as a martial institution, and the weeks surrounding the German surrender were weeks of extraordinary diplomatic complexity. The question of what to do with SS personnel, how to classify them, how to process them, how to balance the requirements of military law with the realities of what had been, discovered was one that lawyers, politicians, and military administrators were actively working through. Patton's explosive personal intervention in that dynamic, while emotionally understandable, complicated things. There was also the matter of Patton's own complicated relationship with the occupation period that was now beginning. As Germany collapsed and the fighting ended, Patton was being asked to do something he was genuinely unsuited for, to govern. The Third Army's area of operations became an occupation zone, and Patton was suddenly responsible not just for military operations, but for the administration of a shattered civilian population. He had to make decisions about food distribution, local government, denazification, the process of removing Nazi Party members from positions of authority in German society. And here is where history becomes uncomfortable. Patton's fury at the SS in that meeting, real, moral, entirely justified, existed alongside a set of views about the post-war situation that were far more problematic. He was deeply, almost obsessively worried about the Soviet Union. He believed, and he was not entirely wrong about this, as subsequent history demonstrated, that Stalin's expansion into Eastern Europe represented a serious long-term threat. He believed that the Western Allies were making a catastrophic mistake by stopping where they had stopped, and he privately advocated positions that were dangerously close to, arguing for a resumption of hostilities against the Soviets before the peace had fully settled. These views led him to decisions about denazification that were, to put it plainly, too lenient. He argued that Germany needed experienced administrators to rebuild, and that experienced administrators in Germany meant, in many cases, former Nazi Party members. He was not wrong that administrative experience was needed. He was wrong, seriously, consequentially wrong, about how that trade-off should be weighted in the immediate aftermath of the worst genocide in history. He made comments in the fall of 1945 that were so tone-deaf about the Nazi Party, comparing it to a political organization that you might join the way you join a Democratic or Republican club, that Eisenhower was finally forced to remove him from command of the Third Army. He was transferred to a paper command, a historical study group, a role so clearly punitive in nature that even Patton understood what it meant. He was finished. He died in December 1945 in a hospital in Heidelberg, 12 days after a car accident on a road outside of Mannheim. He had survived 3 years of combat, multiple near-death experiences, and the sustained hostility of some of the most powerful people in the Allied command. He was killed by a collision at low speed on a road he was traveling on for a pheasant hunting trip. There was no drama in it, no battlefield sacrifice, just the ordinary randomness of an accident on a wet road. He was 60 years old. The meeting with the SS officers sits in the larger story of Patton's life as one of its most clarifying moments, not because it reveals only one thing about him, but because it reveals several things simultaneously, and those things don't fully resolve into a simple portrait. The moral fury he brought to that room was real, and it was right. The demand those SS officers made was genuinely obscene, an attempt to use procedural language and the conventions of military protocol to erase or minimize what their organization had done. Patton's refusal to accept that erasure, his insistence on naming what he had seen and connecting it directly to the men sitting across from him, was an act of moral clarity that deserves to be recognized as such. But moral clarity in one room does not guarantee moral clarity in all rooms. The same man who exploded at SS officers for trying to normalize themselves would, a few months later, make statements that came close to normalizing Nazism in a different context for different reasons, driven by his fear of the Soviets and his frustration with the pace of reconstruction. The contradiction is not comfortable, but it's real, and pretending it doesn't exist would be a disservice to the complexity of the history. What the SS officers had asked for in that meeting in Bavaria was a kind of amnesia. They wanted the men across the table from them to set aside what they knew, to treat the SS uniform as just another uniform, to engage with them as if they were participants in an ordinary conflict rather than members of an organization that had organized and carried out murder on an industrial scale. They wanted the conventions of military protocol to serve as a kind of moral laundry, running their record through the machinery of official procedure until it came out clean. Enough to be handled. Patton refused that. In the most visceral and direct way he was capable of, he refused it. He looked at them and named what they were, and he did it with the full weight of what he had personally witnessed behind his words. That refusal mattered. It mattered in the room, in the immediate and practical sense that those officers did not get what they came for. And it mattered in a larger sense, as a record of what one American general understood about what the war had actually been about. Not just territory, not just strategic. Objectives, not just the defeat of one military power by another, but the defeat of something that had to be named and confronted directly rather than absorbed into the comfortable language of military convention. There's a version of that meeting that could have gone differently. A more cautious general, a more politically careful one, might have managed the interaction differently, might have accepted the demand with qualifications, might have found language that allowed the SS officers to save face while still achieving the practical objective of their unconditional surrender. Military history is full of examples of exactly that kind of managed accommodation, and there are arguments that such accommodation, in certain contexts, serves legitimate, strategic purposes. But Patton was not that kind of general. He never had been. The qualities that made him impossible to manage, the refusal to be diplomatic when he saw something clearly, the inability to subordinate his moral responses to political calculation, the willingness to say loudly and directly what others were quietly thinking, those were the same qualities that had produced his battlefield genius. They couldn't be separated from each other. You couldn't have the Patton who turned an army 90 degrees in an ice storm to relieve Bastogne without also having the Patton who stood up in that room in Bavaria and told SS officers exactly what he thought of their demand. He was one thing, indivisible and irreducible, for better and for worse. The men who were in that room, the staff officers, the interpreter, the American soldiers who escorted the SS delegation in and out, carried the memory of what happened there. for the rest of their lives. Some of them spoke about it in interviews decades later. Some of them left written accounts. All of them described it as one of the most extraordinary things they had ever witnessed, not because of the volume of Patton's response, not because of the specific words he used, but because of the quality of what was behind the words. The absolute, uncontainable conviction of a man who had seen something with his own eyes and was not going to allow it to be papered over. One member of his staff, speaking years later, said something that stayed in the historical record because of its precision. He said that in all his time with Patton, through all the battles and the crises and the moments where the general's temper had filled entire rooms, he had never seen Patton look at anyone the way he looked at those SS officers. He said that in all the explosions he had witnessed, he had never seen one where the anger was so clearly not performance, where there was no separation between the man and the feeling, where what you were watching was not the general's famous tactical fury, but something underneath it, something that had been reached and could not be put back. He said that after those officers left the room, Patton stood for a moment without speaking. And then he said something quiet, something none of them expected from a man who had just delivered that kind of broadside. He said that he hoped what those men had seen in his face stayed with them for whatever time they had left, that they should at least have to carry that in their eyes. He then put his helmet on, picked up his gloves, and walked out of the building. There was no ceremony to it, no final pronouncement, no performance, just a man who had said what needed to be said and was already moving on to the next thing, because there was always a next thing, and the war, even in its dying days, did not stop to let you process what it had taken from you or what it had forced you to see. He climbed into his Jeep. His driver pulled out onto a road that led through a town that 3 weeks earlier had been flying swastika flags and was now trying to figure out how to look as though it had. Never believed in anything at all. Patton rode through it without looking at it. He was thinking, probably, about the next objective. He was always thinking about the next objective. It was how he survived the things he saw. It was how he kept moving when other men might have stopped. It was the mechanism by which a man with that much feeling managed to function in a world that demanded, continuously, that feeling be subordinated to decision. The next objective. Always the next objective. But somewhere behind the calculation, somewhere in the part of him that he didn't talk about and rarely showed, he was carrying what had happened in that room, what those men had asked for. What it meant that they had asked for it, what it meant that they had believed, even in the final hours of their organization's existence, that the right play was to walk into a room with an American general and present. Demands. It meant that they had not understood what they were. It meant that the machinery of ideology had insulated them so completely from accountability that even in defeat, even with the evidence of their actions being walked through by Allied soldiers and documented and photographed and preserved, they still thought they could negotiate. Patton had understood what they were. He had made sure they left that room knowing that he understood. It was, in a career full of extraordinary moments, one of the most revealing. Not the most famous, not the most cinematic, but in some ways the most honest, a window into the thing inside the general that the uniform and the theater and the legend couldn't quite contain. He died 7 months later, on a wet road, on his way to go hunting. He left behind an army that had moved faster and further than any in history. He left behind a military record that remains, decades later, the subject of study and argument and genuine awe. He left behind a personality so large and so contradictory that no single story can hold all of it. But in that room in Bavaria, in the spring of 1945, for those few minutes when the SS officers laid their demand on the table and Patton stood up, in that moment, he was something specific and clear. He was a man who had seen what the war was actually about, and he was not going to let it be forgotten. Not in that room, Not by those men. Not on his watch.